Thank you, Deepa. I'm really happy to be here.
Great. Well, let's just jump right in. As financial crime and sanctions risks grow more complex, global institutions and regulators are rethinking traditional compliance frameworks. This keynote, this fireside chat is more like it, explores how the industry is evolving from reactive enforcement toward proactive systemic reform by leveraging technology, data, and collaboration to build more resilient, future-ready financial systems. Um, let's set the stage a little bit for our group. Starting with your role in sanctions, could you speak broadly to the sanctions landscape? What are you seeing as current sanctions priorities?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I was in government up until May of this year, and I have been at the Treasury Department. So I was fortunate to see the shift in the prioritization focus from the prior administration to this administration. Very clearly, last administration, there was a huge focus on Russia sanctions, including pushing out at the end of the administration as many Russia actions as they could. And that quickly went away. And the new administration, sanctions wise, started focusing really, really laser focused on Iran and cartels in the beginning. I would also put Iran with counterterrorism. Sometimes there's crossover, like seeing some of the Iranian-based militias and bad actors kind of counterterrorism sometime. But that sort of focus to repeat action after action after action related to Iran's activities, particularly its oil exports, was really notable. I think in the beginning of this administration, one thing that we saw was the willingness to go after third party importers of Iranian oil. And we saw that in the case of what's called Chinese teapot oil refineries. I think that focus, I mean, the Treasury Secretary and the new Undersecretary Hurley have made many statements that they're going to continue to tighten sanctions in this space. But there also have been other notable shifts. One of the shifts was the lifting of Syria sanctions, which was done globally. This was announced by major jurisdictions globally of the lifting of these sanctions. As a sanctions person and an AML person, I love to see when sanctions are lifted because it just seems like over the past 15 years, we just continue to accumulate new sanctions programs. When I started in Treasury 14 years ago, I think there was only like 15 sanctions programs, and now there's something like 40 sanctions programs. So it's just a personal view, but I was very happy to see the lifting of serious sanctions because the goal of sanctions is to change behavior and not to indefinitely punish. We've also seen some more controversial sanctions, and this is a space to keep an eye on. There were at the beginning of this second Trump administration, there was a new executive order on the International Criminal Court, and this is the first time I've sort of seen an executive order targeting an organization like the ICC. I was wondering if it was just sort of a threat, but then we saw indeed designations against actual ICC judges. So that's something to watch. Um, we also saw sanctions, another couple controversial sanctions against the Brazilian president and the Colombian president, and a Colombian judge and his associate. So, I'm just keeping an eye on these areas because typically in the past, the U.S. authorities have tried to align their sanctions programs with the EU, the UK, and others. In the cases of these sanctions programs, I doubt that there'll be an opportunity for alignment. But it also means that we have to think about this more broadly in terms of how we look at risks and how we apply sanctions. Um, Another interesting trend that I don't know if industry's really caught on to, but I am really excited about, is the sanctions on fraud networks. So we all know that pig butchering has been a massive problem. I think another word for pig butchering, and the more appropriate term, is romance schemes or confidence-based scams. This is when you receive in your phone a text message from some random person, and then they try and get you to gain trust in them, whether it's through romance or through a fake company that you can invest in, and then to send funds via often cryptocurrency. So for the first time, I'm seeing sanctions on fraud networks, because what's happened in Southeast Asia is that there's these massive sort of compounds where people are the criminality is twofold, where people are human trafficked into the compounds and then forced into defrauding people. So it's really interesting to see this intersection between fraud and sanctions, and I think it's a really good use of sanctions to highlight this. There was a massive action a couple of weeks ago that involved a $15 billion seizure of Bitcoin. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that there was finally Russia sanctions as of this past month on Rosneft and Lukoil. Many of us were sitting waiting to see if there were going to be any Russia sanctions under this administration, especially because we saw the EU accelerating their sanctions programs on Russia, and doing so very aggressively with fairly massive packages, and the U.S. staying silent. So we did see that Rosneft and Lukoil, sort of the two major oil companies that had not been sanctioned, were sanctioned by the U.S. just recently. It's a really interesting space to watch, and I think the sanctions always speak to where the foreign policy focus of the administration is. But I think that we'll continue to see more of the same in terms of narcotics trafficking, cartels, Iran, and then hopefully more of this fraud targeting.
Sorry, I was having trouble finding my mute button. Thank you for that. No, that's very interesting, and it's great to see some trends out there that we may be aware of, and then also making us aware of trends that we may not have known of before. So thank you. Next question I have is, we're also seeing the administration use new tools beyond sanctions to achieve national security goals. Can you speak to some of the novel statecraft tools this administration has used?
Yeah. Thanks for this question. I am a regulatory nerd, and I love to see how different legislation is being deployed. So one key thing that happened sort of just after I joined the bank was a designation, not even a designation, the identification of 3 Mexican banks under a new authority, and this was an action by FinCEN. It's always interesting to watch. FinCEN being the AML regulator and OFAC being the sanctions regulator. It's always interesting to watch who takes which actions, because a lot of times their authorities can be overlapping, and particularly in a case like this where they're targeting financial institutions. So they targeted 3 Mexican-based financial institutions as primary money laundering concern in connection with illicit opioid trafficking. This means that it was a prohibition on a transmittal of funds between U.S. institutions and these three entities. But realistically, when FinCEN uses a 311-like authority, that's what I would call this. This is a Section 311 authority to target financial institutions. They usually has overwhelming impact on the institution, and requires and causes the institution generally to go into liquidation. So it was interesting to see this. I was surprised to see 3 institutions all at once, but it's a space to watch. And I think, again, this speaks to the desire of the administration to go after sort of narcotics trafficking, and more specifically illicit opioid trafficking, and the formal financial system that enables it. Another key thing that we saw just recently, and this was a bit of a surprise to me, was the U.S. Department of Commerce came out with their own 50% rule. I know they had been thinking about this, but it came out very abruptly, and they made it an immediately effective rule, an interim final rule, which is really a challenge for businesses, because without really a lot of analysis about how these rules can be implemented effectively, and also the burden on businesses, I was a bit surprised to see this. Essentially, the idea of the rule is similar to the OFAC rule. Again, I'm a regulatory nerd, where OFAC has said that when an entity is 50 or more percent owned or controlled by a designated entity, itself is controlled. So the same thing, they're calling it the affiliates rule with commerce, was applying to a couple of the commerce-based lists. And then sort of the curiosity of this evolved very recently, because on November 1st, the Treasury Secretary announced that BIS, so this is the Treasury Secretary announcing something about the Commerce Department, announced that they would suspend this rule as part of the negotiations between the US and China. I think for institutions, all institutions should look at, all right, we were given a reprieve for a year for this rule. They may decide to implement it before then, even if they've announced it for a year. So we should all be looking at how we can best implement this rule in the longer term. If there's time, I have a couple more examples. Does that work, Deepa?
Yeah, sure.
Great. One, I think this is the obvious one, just like sort of sharing what everyone knows, but tariffs. I know we were all expecting tariffs, but the use of tariffs so broadly across the globe has been really striking. And what I'm observing is that tariffs are sometimes being used as a substitute for sanctions. And it's becoming sort of the preferred foreign policy tool because it is so immediate. I mean, sanctions can be very, very quick, but tariffs, it seems, just announces and then can become effective right away, or at least the threat of them becomes effective right away. What's also interesting is that the administration is using the sanctions authority, so the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEPA, which is the underlying statute that underpins sanctions, to institute tariffs. And just last week, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on the challenges to President Trump's authority to impose these tariffs under the IEPA. So it's a space to watch. I think we're expecting that maybe in a couple of months there might be a decision made by the Supreme Court on this, but it wouldn't be outside of the norm for the Supreme Court to opine beyond just the exact nature of this case. And so we'll be watching the IEPA space very, very closely. And one last thing is just the outbound investment rule. I think that was a different part of the Treasury Department, putting rules on sort of services, particularly involving Chinese entities, and it's just another one that we're all watching and looking to effectively implement.
Thank you. Pivoting to your Wolfsburg hat, what do you see as the key priorities for Wolfsburg over the coming months?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Wolfsburg is a collection of 12 banks that focus on policymaking surrounding AML and CFT. And this is so near and dear to my heart. When I was in the government, I participated in the Wolfsburg group because I was really strongly pushing for reform changes. I was involved in the AML program rule drafting and the issuance. And so now that I'm in the private sector, I am so fortunate that UBS is the co-chair of Wolfsburg Group for the next couple of years. So Wolfsburg has always had a very leading voice in terms of the policymaking space on anti-money laundering. And they've always had like three key principles, which is provide highly useful information to government authorities, to law enforcement, establish a reasonable and risk-based set of controls to mitigate risks, and to comply with the laws and regulations. And so these three principles were novel maybe 6 years ago or however long it was, but now these have become sort of standards and the expectation of where reform should take place in the AML space. In terms of concrete things that Wolfsburg has done, in July of this year, the Wolfsburg Group released the statement on the risk-based approach to, again, underscore the core elements of a risk-based approach. They hadn't updated anything since 2006 on risk-based approach. So I thought this was a really good sort of re-upping, a refocus on this is where we need the supervisors to be focused and the regulators to be focused, is making sure that institutions are held to a standard of being risk-based. Another area, and what was an unbelievably popular paper, like I think it's gotten zillions of clicks, was the Wolfsburg paper on stable coins. This is a really important piece on the conceptual approach to banking a stablecoin issuer, and particularly with the Genius Act, which is a huge priority for FinCEN right now, the implementation of this stablecoin legislation. I think that this really goes hand in hand with that, because it's guidance for people in the financial industry of how to manage the relationship with stablecoin issuers, the customer relationship, and managing the risks. So if you all haven't reviewed it and you are involved with stablecoin issuers, I highly, highly recommend taking a look at that. In terms of what's to come, we are just highly engaged with government regulators to make progress in terms of the things that they've openly stated that they want to achieve for examinations and for the regulatory space and innovation. I'm very excited to watch the AI space grow and to see how Wolfsburg can continue to promote the responsible use of AI in financial institutions.
Okay, great. Well, along those same lines, let's go ahead and jump into AI. Where do you see the greatest opportunity for AI, for advanced analytics and automation to transform sanction screening and broader compliance frameworks? What organizational or cultural changes are needed for FIs to successfully integrate responsible innovation, but while remaining compliant with regulatory expectations?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And AI has existed for a long time, rules-based AI. But now we're just seeing such a proliferation and evolution of AI at such an incredible rate. It's an amazing time to be alive, right? I tell people all the time that I'm really fortunate that I made sort of the jump from the private sector to the public sector when I did, because now I get to observe from the public side sort of this revolutionary change, and to see where I can plug into it, which is exciting. In terms of the broader compliance frameworks and the bigger picture question about the use of AI, I think there's a few core things, and one is the messaging. So I will say that the messaging surrounding AI at the top of the government feels right, right? Like, we want to allow innovation, we want to help the growth here. And I think the question will come through that regulatory process is, how is an AI, it's not, how is that AI encouraged, that use of AI encouraged through the regulatory structures, right? There's no prohibition on the use of AI, but any financial institution knows that they have to really think carefully about what their regulators and their supervisors' expectations are. And I think that this is one area where there'll need to be a strong connection point between the policymakers of the supervisors and then the actual examiners who come in to examine institutions, to make sure that there's sort of that broad agreement that they are going to encourage the use of AI in systems. There's also a responsibility aspect that falls on financial institutions. We need to remain compliant with all our regulatory expectations, of course, and senior management needs to stay highly engaged and focused on risk appetite and how these things are implemented at the most granular of levels. Another sort of aspect of this, and it's an area where Wolfsburg is putting some of its focus, is on the model risk management piece. In 2021, the federal functional regulators came out with model risk management guidance on how to model risk in the AML space, and the fact that it doesn't need to be held at the same levels of other types of risk-based modeling. However, there is just nonetheless, such a regulatory focus on model risk management. So I think that will be sort of a crucial area for us to develop. Finally, and I think my third point on AI, is that financial crimes compliance departments need to be ready to explain the approach, to demonstrate how the approach aligns with the FI's revised measures of effectiveness, and also ready to train their staff and to get staff up to speed on the use of AI, the responsible use of AI, and determining the more complex results. I mean, I think that in some of these spaces, AI can just be incredibly effective, more so than humans. But it's a matter of actually getting to that place.
Great. Let's pause here for a quick question. How does the chair see the rest of the world doing business with China, considering AFSL, which may lead to more circumvention?
Um, it's a great question. The anti-foreign sanctions law is something that we are constantly aware of. It's something that we're thinking about, and this is like a broader geopolitical question, which is um, the the um, the the tension and the sort of even under Secretary Yellen's leadership, she saw a need to uh, detangle some of some economic dependency on China. And so I think that this is a really question that goes so academic, right? It's like the bipolar world. Like, what does the world look like if there becomes a bipolar world? And are we in a bipolar world right now where the United States is one center of power, the West is one center of power, and then China is another center of power? More granularly, in terms of the anti-foreign sanctions law, this is where sanctions are just particularly interesting because it becomes a matter of like the fact pattern, right? So when we're looking at sanctions broadly, we want to apply a global approach to sanctions to ensure the best possible compliance. And then when you're looking at granular fact patterns of like these specific things, and this is how China might react with their anti-foreign sanctions law, I think that those are where the conflict of law issues really come to the fore. And it goes back to that broader point I sort of made earlier, which is we have to watch the space to see if there becomes a broad fissure. And I don't think we're there, but a broad fissure in sanctions policy, because then those conflict of law issues come to the fore even more. But I take the point. I think China's made some recent designations under their anti-foreign sanctions law of U.S. firms located in Taiwan, I think, and it's something to watch.
Great. And thank you, audience member, for submitting that question. You were talking a little bit about public-private collaboration. So where is the public-private collaboration working well today? And what must change for intelligence sharing models to scale globally?
Yeah, so I am a huge fan of public-private partnerships. When I was at FinCEN, I oversaw the team that deployed sort of FinCEN's public-private partnerships, which took a few different forms. And it's been exciting to see sort of the proliferation of public-private partnerships. I would say a few things. One thing is that public-private partnerships are most effective, and I think we all know this, when there's the sharing of actionable information. So whether that's actionable sort of information derived from intelligence, or actionable information that can lead to better transaction monitoring tools. Like back at FinCEN, we used to have really amazing FinCEN exchanges where institutions who were focused on a particular type of for instance, fentanyl, or a particular type of typology would present to other financial institutions about how they're looking at that typology and the things that they found, so that everyone can kind of better tune their systems. I think those are the best. I love it when that happens. I think that another question is we have to fix information sharing domestically. So kind of pivoting a bit from public-private to private. There has to be really strong mechanisms for domestic information sharing, not only within the US, but globally throughout the world. Each domestic system needs to have its own way of sharing information among institutions. And I want to fix that domestically first before I think we can expect to have really broad cross-border information sharing. I think everyone hopes that there can be cross-border information sharing, but I'll give an example of 314B, which 314B is the FinCEN authorization to share information between financial institutions. Really interesting use cases. There are some financial institutions that are very, very comfortable using 314V. They've sort of developed groupings that will share information proactively. But then other institutions are just not using it because A, it's not required. B, does it really benefit them when they could just file a SAR? And so I like the US's model, but I think it's also worth comparing to other models globally. Last year, Singapore came out with the COSMIC system. This is the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. They launched a digital platform with 6 major commercial banks, and they launched it themselves. So as opposed to FinCEN, which just says you can share information among yourselves, Singapore proactively launched its own platform that allows the FIs to share information on specific customers who exhibit red flags, and then also help make it easier for FIs to detect criminal activity. So I think that the private to private information sharing is a space to watch. I say this from sort of my former Treasury hat, having sort of been involved in the promotion of some of these tools. Another space broadly is just in the proliferations of public-private partnerships. There are a lot. There are a lot of public-private partnerships. Everyone has jumped on the bandwagon. And I think it's always worth taking the moment to step back and reflect and to say which model is working best, which model could use some optimization, because I think everyone is pressed for time in this industry, and particularly the governments who are often resource strapped want to get the most out of these public-private partnerships, and also want to make sure that the participants that they're putting these on for, they're made for the private sector, are getting the most out of it too.
Great. Well, we have about 3 minutes left in your time with us today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some future outlook. What advice would you give to compliance professionals that want to lead rather than just comply as threats evolve?
Yeah, I really like this question because it's so broad and there's so much we can do, right? I think so. Financial crimes is an exciting space, and I think for the leadership teams, the most important thing you can do is to inspire your teams, to remind them of the really good things that they can achieve and the sorts of things that you're fighting, right? If you just go to the FinCEN website and pull down the list of advisories and the list of topics that financial crime professionals are working on, it's so extensive, right? You're helping your citizens not be defrauded by bad actors. You're helping make sure that there's no facilitation of export of goods to Russia that can be used to make drones to bomb Ukraine. It's really tangible good work. And so, but sometimes day to day, it's hard to remember how important and good this work is. So I think that's a key thing for me, and also making sure that the teams are focused on recruitment. This is a known career path, and that this is a really interesting space. The next thing, in terms of leading as a professional and leading as a bank, get involved in the industry group. I think there's not one sort of financial institution that doesn't have a major industry group representing it. And often these industry groups are sort of begging for people with the bandwidth to give leadership to these groups. So I would say volunteer, raise your hand, get involved, because then you can be part of the thought leaders on this. I think particularly in this space where there's a desire to reform and to improve how financial crime is used, examined, deployed, there's a huge voice for industry groups. And so I couldn't encourage that enough. And I think just finally, and this is advice for everyone in every way, but it's financial crimes. So make sure you have a great network. Make sure that you have people to bounce things off with. Benchmarking is super useful, so you kind of get a sense of how others are dealing with new problems, particularly in response to the new, just what we referenced earlier, sort of the new use of authorities. When these new authorities come out or when there's something unexpected, benchmarking is so helpful because you can kind of tease out the high level problems that might exist with a new authority, and then put those questions through an industry group that might have a lot of influence to get FAQs issued or whatever else. So Yeah, it's been really exciting, and I think Wolfsburg is doing all of these things. Like for instance, we saw some really helpful FAQs come out from the Treasury Department, and those were largely in response to direct engagement by the Wolfsburg Group asking Treasury for some relief and clarification about things that take a lot of time but might not be highly useful to law enforcement. So I think it works, and I encourage everyone to get involved as they can.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I'm going to put in a little plug here for BAFT as an industry association that is heavily involved in financial crimes mitigation and advocacy and compliance, and has regular contact with a lot of the regulatory bodies around the world, including Treasury and FinCEN. So, I am going to echo Catherine's remarks on that it's never too late to get involved. It's always feasible to get involved, and get involved in all facets of financial crimes mitigation.